Welcome to the Town Hall Seattle Arno Matulski Science Series. On October 19th, 2019, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Ian Urbina came to our forum stage to talk about the wildest and least understood frontier on our planet, the world's oceans. Ian introduced us to the inhabitants of this hidden realm, revealed the disturbing reality of a floating world that connects us all, and presented his new book, The Outlaw Ocean: Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier.
I think of the ocean as this space that has been kind of a metaphor for freedom. And it still is that. You know, it is a place that people go to escape rules and escape government and escape other people because it's so expansive. But those very allures of the space are what has made the ocean a scary place.
Don't take photos, don't take photos. So I put the camera down.
Few places on the planet are as lawless as the high seas. The ocean is a place of amazing beauty, but it's also this dystopian realm where severe inhumanities occur, and often with impunity.
Over.
What you realize when you're in that void or in that expanse is that most of that space is ungoverned and ungovernable. There are few laws, and what laws exist are murky and overlapping and contradictory. Laws are only as good as their enforcement, and the enforcement mechanisms for any of the laws are anemic at best. You have human trafficking, sea slavery, abuse of stowaways, weapons trafficking. When the UN looked at it in 2009 and they interviewed Cambodian deckhands, over 50% of them had witnessed murder. A lot of the forced labor that end up on these fishing boats are trafficked migrants and are very poor and easily taken advantage of. One mariner summed it up as, this line of work is like jail with a salary, except the salary is not guaranteed. We in the West would like to think that things are progressively getting better, and in many ways they are, but in this space, things are arguably getting worse. Over 99% of crimes that occur out there go unreported. And there's not a huge point in reporting them because it's never clear who would actually do anything with that information. I think if there's anything to be learned about human nature from the Outlaw Ocean, it's that we all have this visceral capacity to behave in ways that we thought civilization had stamped out. There's a vanishingly thin line between civilization and the lack of it. And I think the exploration of this frontier is an attempt to look at how thin that line is and what's on the other side. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. And I was asked to talk for 40 minutes, but it's not out of laziness that I asked to perhaps talk for 15, 20. It's more out of a desire to get to Q&A, which I think might elicit more interesting conversation. I'm going to assume that most people in the room haven't read the book, and so my thought was to just talk about sort of the arc of this reporting and sort of what we initially, we being the New York Times and the team around me that launched on it, set out to do, and then sort of some of the highlights of what I found. So just to take one step back to give context on what I do. So I've been on staff at the Times for about 17 years now, up until very recently. I had always wanted to be doing this kind of journalism, which is long form narrative investigative journalism, enterprise, coming up with your own ideas and being given the luxury of time to chase them and sort of get off what I felt like was the rat wheel of beat reporting. It took me a while to arrive to that post, but the key thing that I sought in this type of journalism was twofold. One, time, the ability to actually chase things that merited deeper investigation. And two, a release from the he said, she said type journalism that often is required in beat reporting. I wanted to get more to investigative reporting, which, as I define it, has a mandate to do sort of prosecutorial pursuit of topics that you highlight for the sake of showing what's broken. So in that context, the Outlaw Ocean was an idea that to some degree grew from my career before I went into journalism, which was I was in grad school and working as a cultural anthropologist. And as such, I left the academic life and went into journalism, hoping to continue that sort of international travel and look at generally invisible populations with a kind of keen eye toward what made them tick. And while procrastinating my dissertation, I ran away from cold winters in Chicago and my dissertation and took a job as a deckhand on a research vessel that was anchored in Singapore. And it was a funny thing because I was running away from one anthropological topic and I ended up backing into another in the sense that upon arriving to Singapore and spending time in this community of mostly men who work on these ships, I became riveted by what I saw as sort of a transient diaspora tribe of largely invisible people that have their own kind of code of conduct and lexicon and relationship with time and crime. From the stories that I was hearing, I was sort of blown away by the things that were happening out there. So I ultimately went back to Chicago and had this hankering to explore that that group of people. I had always been interested in the blue on the world map, kind of the specks, especially the little islands that were in the middle of the blue. But now I was really interested in the people that were traversing that blue. Got a job at the Times and sort of over the course of many years, pitched the unrefined notion to editors, hey, we should really do something about that 2/3 of the planet out there that is both essential from an environmental standpoint, 50% of the oxygen we breathe, and kind of temperature stabilizer of the planet and huge source of protein for millions of people, et cetera, not to mention 90% of what we consume traversing it, seemed like an important place, and 56 million people happen to work out there. And so I thought, it'd be great, maybe even public service, to take our readers out to that space and explore it. So that was kind of one of the initial goals, motivations I had in pitching this series at my editor at the Times. The other goal was when I would talk with, my mom or someone else and say that I was trying to get an editor on board to do something about maritime crime, I would often hear in response, so like Somali piracy or the BP spill. And these were kind of the two big things that most people thought of when it came to bad stuff that happens out there, which indeed they are. But I kind of knew for a fact that the diversity of that bad stuff that happens out there was much wider, and that too seemed like potentially a public service to sort of inform the public of the wide range of nefarious, consequential behavior that's occurring out there, and not always bad. Mostly, as the name of the book hints, extra legal. So there's real heroism out there, and as well, but it's often kind of outside the confines of the law. So those were my core motivations at the outset, aside from just getting the gray lady to pay me to go to sea and get out of the newsroom. And I finally, after a couple of years of trying, found an editor who warmed to the notion. And the series ran in the Times. Initially, it was supposed to be 3 stories, and we published those. And I was sort of trying to figure out what my next thing was when I got a call from, several editors, the executive editor and my editor, and said, it's getting a lot of attention, seems to be getting interesting traction. Why don't we think about a next round? And so we did 3 more, sent me back out and went various places and produced 3 more stories and then 1 magazine piece. And it's at that juncture, late 2016, that there was interest from, book people. And I had left so many stories on the cutting room floor, and they bothered me. I kept looking down at them metaphorically and wanting to pick them back up. And so I convinced the paper to give me roughly a 2-year book leave so that I could go back out to sea and chase those stories. So the end result is the book, 15 chapters, 5 of which were kind of built out versions of the original stories, and the 10 are new material. And, it kind of covers, again, forgive me for those who've read it to be rehashing this, but it kind of covers, it attempts to establish the corners of the canvas, kind of to really show the diversity of extra-legal behavior out there and the sort of the both inspiring and dark characters that are out there. And so it looks at the problem of sea slavery, trafficked, forced labor on mostly on fishing vessels. It looks at that component of it, looks at the South China Sea and the Thai fleet, but the book actually, as different from the original series, also looks at some of these issues as they play out elsewhere, off the coast of New Zealand, near the Falkland Islands, and it's not limited to the South China Sea. Murder of stowaways post 9/11, and sort of how September 11 really changed how stowaways are dealt with, and arms trafficking and this weird world of private maritime security, and these specific bizarre realm where a lot of these guys, and again, this is a very overwhelmingly male world, where they pass the time between deployments on these floating armories, which are in international waters, and sort of 1 part bunkhouse, 1 part arms depot. And Murder with Impunity, book delves into a long investigation of a slow motion slaughter that occurred and was captured on a cell phone that was found in the back of a taxi in Fiji. And it shows over the course of 10 minutes and 26 seconds, these guys in the water, we eventually figured out who roughly they were, but being picked off one by one by guys on some deck, Taiwanese tuna longliner, it turns out. And at the end of the video, and this was what kind of tipped the scales for me to launch in the investigation, the witnesses or the culprits, it's unclear, but someone, a bunch of guys who were on the scene and on deck posed for selfies, sort of celebratory selfies. And it struck me that, if ever there was a clear example of a crime that we at the New York Times could really do something about, here it was. So that's a piece that ran in the paper and also gets built out in the book. The problem of intentional dumping, so the problem of, ships that are not inadvertently spilling oil, but ships that are intentionally releasing it. Every 3 years, ships intentionally dump more oil into the oceans than the BP spill and the Exxon Valdez spill combined. And sort of it's a very overlooked problem. And I kind of wanted to tackle that and sort of explain how it happens. And ocean, acidification and coral reef destruction, and sort of the battle that goes on between conservationists and fossil fuel industry over the seafloor and who gets to say what happens there. So there's a wide variety of, and abortion providing in international waters, it's all over the map. And that was the point. In the end, I think the book is, spoiler alert, pretty bummer. Be careful about giving to anyone for Christmas. But hopefully it's a little bit inspiring too, in a couple of ways. One, between the pages, there are really compelling, heroic characters who are out there, be they, the Underground Railroad of anti-trafficking advocates who specialize in trying to rescue these sea slaves and put their lives at risk in doing so. These direct action vigilante conservationists who are out there kind of, you can argue legitimately about their tactics and whether they're productive or counterproductive, but they're clearly following their beliefs and trying to protect things beyond themselves. I mentioned in passing a woman named Rebecca Gompertz, a doctor who specializes and has an organization called Women on Waves that brings a ship to the coast of places where abortions are illegal and dangerous, and sort of plugs into this covert network of healthcare providers that surreptitiously funnel them young girls and women who are in need of abortions. And Rebecca and her mates on the ship take these women out to the high seas where the jurisdictional authority switches, and they're able to administer medical abortions, so RU 486. So they're very compelling, interesting, in many ways heroic characters out there doing pretty daring things among the dark characters. And I also, I guess, in a very journalistic sort of way, my hope was that as dark as the book and its content are, hopefully in the act of pulling it all together in one place and in the effort of doing so in a rigorous, nuanced, ideally fair-minded fashion, even leaning into trying to understand the logic of the dumpers or the slavers or the murderers, really kind of getting into and representing their headspace or the larger factors that are at work beyond their headspace. Hopefully in that activity, there's something inspiring in the sense that in these pages, there's a rich chronicling of a world largely untold, that's sort of a lawless frontier that happens to cover 2/3 of the planet. And here is a attempted encyclopedic rendering of who's out there and what's happening, all under the umbrella of a core notion that there's a dire lack of governance. So, then I hand the book forward to the public and say, choose your battles and, go for it, but we can no longer have an out of sight, out of mind perspective on this space and these people, because we're all complicit in things that now that we know, we probably need to do something about. So those are my goals. And I don't know if I've spoken for 20 minutes or 15, but I think I'll stop there and maybe open it up to questions and go from there. But we already have one, sure.
Yes, I wanted to ask, what are some of the more powerful experiences that you've seen yourself or were in proximity of, experiences that were good or bad, and what did what lessons did they teach you?
So, and just so I can get bullseye onto your specific interest, powerful in the sense of dangerous or powerful in the sense of just in any sense?
Powerful in terms of, I guess, danger, but also on the side of the good. You know?
Yeah, compelling, dangerous. So dangerous. Well, I'll give a couple examples since the line's thin. My answers will get longer until that line gets longer. So there are two stages, right? There's the stage when I was reporting under the auspices of the Times, and then there was the stage when I was reporting not, for the 2 years on my own. And during that second stage, I sought to do something that I was not allowed to do when I was at the Times, which is go to Somalia and go specifically to the most dangerous state within Somalia, namely a place called Puntland, which is the sort of, if you look at the map of Africa, it's the rhinoceros horn on that continent, and it's the spot that sort of is across from Yemen. And Puntland is this really, kind of, it's ostensibly part of Somalia, but very much not. And much of the sketchy behavior that comes out of Somalia, be it trafficking of militants that are fighting in Yemen, or trafficking of khat, this drug-like plant, or much of the piracy that was going on in 2008, 2009, a lot of that stuff was launching from Puntland. And I thought, well, if I'm going to write a book called The Outlaw Ocean, I really got to go there and understand that place and its specific role. And so part of the reason I'm telling this story is because I brought with me this really, charismatic and colorful character who was sort of my local knowledge guy. You often on trips like this really want to find someone who knows people and knows nuances and is based in the region. And I found this guy, named Peter, and his mom and sister in the crowd, Judy and Cass, and I had a Brazilian photographer who I'd hired at the beginning of the book stage to come with me for the next 2 years. So Fabio and Peter and I were going to work our way into Puntland. Cutting to the dangerous part. We went in with one story in mind. It was actually meant to be a good news story. And we had all the appropriate permissions from local kind of tribal leaders and the state government and the federal government. Within a week of being there, everything flipped upside down. So our relationship with the local authorities went sour, and things began getting very dodgy, largely because they became convinced that I was not actually there to report on this one case. That was actually something that reflected well on them. But instead, I was there to report on this other case. And so they kept saying, but you're not going to look at these 7 Thai vessels, right? And that's the worst thing ever to say to an investigative reporter. And I kept being like, stop asking me that, no, but don't ask me again, because then I'm going to be obligated to actually look there. And so, of course, I started looking there. It was just what was going on there was this really egregious, horrific situation of these 7 Thai vessels who were engaged in, sea slavery and illegal fishing, to a large degree with complicity of the local authorities. And these guys were so bad that even the Thais had kicked them off their flag. And the local Puntland authorities did not want us looking into that. And of course, quickly we did. We got in trouble there in Somalia, and for a very tense 48 hours. I hope I'm not getting Peter in trouble with his mom right now, but I don't know how much they know about this, but we kind of lost much of our security. We had to sort of release them because we weren't sure who we could trust, and we sort of had to hide out on the roof of this building while we tried to figure out how we were going to get out of Puntland. And you couldn't travel by road because Al-Shabaab and ISIS ran the roads, and there were only flights every 4 days or something like that. So we were on the front end of that stint. So we were in trouble. And that was definitely one of the moments where I thought, okay, this is really bad. I'm not sure how we're going to get out of here. And there were bombs going off, right? It was all sort of coming in on us. And I had sources in the know, CIA types and folks who weren't in the region. We were the only Westerners in the state, but they were monitoring it however they do. And they were texting me saying, you got to get out there. There's all this chatter about you guys being there. They're moving closer and closer to your compound, like really scary stuff. And I was like, yeah, how? Unless you guys are going to come airlift us out. So what did I learn? I would do it again. I learned that, especially in moments like that, it is utterly essential to have picked people who can handle that kind of reporting. In this case, Peter and Fabio and I, those two guys were amazing. We were all scared shitless, but they were calm about it, and they followed the command structure I had set up. And that was that. If that had not been the case, I think it might have ended differently. If they hadn't trusted me to some degree and sort of really taken this situation seriously. So it reminded me that even when you think you're going on a relatively safe thing, we were invited, and it's just going to be a cakewalk because we've got the federal and the state government totally backing us up and fighting over who's going to provide us security. You never know what's going to happen on the ground, and you lose all your security and got two guys left, and the security is the one who's coming to get you. So you got to really choose your people well in this kind of reporting. I also made mistakes in that same category, in the sense that the further down the chain of trust you get, in terms of, I had my inner team, but then I had to rely on, translators who were locally hired and fixers who were locally hired. And it gets darker and darker in terms of being able to assess those folks. You're talking with them by phone and text before you meet them in country. And I called it wrong with a couple of those guys. And I think those were part of how we were most at risk. So that would be the lesson learned. Now, the happy, uplifting moment. Well, you can see me struggling. Honestly, I don't know how to make this interesting, but one of the most uplifting, I find in general, I mentioned it before, one of the most uplifting kind of categories of characters in the reporting on the sea slavery front are these anti-trafficking folks who make up this sort of disparate underground railroad of kind of underfunded, usually a 2-3, typically women office in port in Songkhla or Borneo or these various places where there often are guys that are trying to escape these fishing boats, and they get off and they're completely vulnerable. They're Cambodian, say, escaping a Thai vessel. They don't speak Thai. They're in Borneo or on some atoll near Borneo. They stick out. And they don't even know where they are. They don't have ability to, communicate with anyone. All they know is now is their chance to run. And they jump off, they swim to shore, and they run. And then they are like, where to go to? And often, somehow, not always successfully, these folks get word of who they are or that they're there, and a race ensues between the anti-trafficking folks and the hired bounty hunters who word has been put out by the captain. In their view, property has been stolen. I paid for this guy's labor. I paid $500 to the person who brought him in. He's only been working for $100 worth. So, and $400 is a big deal. And that car just drove away. And so they put the word out that got to bring this guy back. And that word usually goes to an informal network of moped taxis who are tied in with the karaoke bars, which are brothels. That's usually how it works. But the moped guys are the eyes and ears, and they know and see everything. And if they're in Borneo, they can spot a Cambodian guy like that, especially one who's scared and hiding and kind of looking over his shoulder. So that team is way more powerful than the other team that's trying to find them too. And the work of those anti-trafficking folks is just incredible and inspiring. And the time that I spent shadowing them just kind of gave me faith in people's ethics. Long answer to a short question. But say again.
How did you get out of the danger?
How do we get out of it? You got to read the book. No. How do we get out of it? We hid out. We then convinced. The schedule changed and a plane arrived early. Not for anything we did, but we got lucky, and we got to the airport. And getting to the airport was actually probably the most perilous moment of the whole thing in some ways, because when we hid out, we did so in a fashion that made it look like we were remaining in my room. So we sort of set up the room to look like we were still there. But then, and we kind of released most of the guards, except for the 2 or 3 guys we really trusted, and the hotel manager. And we then snuck up to the roof and hid there. So no one other than folks I think were totally trustworthy knew we were there. But the minute we left, there's only one route you can go from the compound to the airport. And when planes arrive, everyone knows. So the folks who wanted to do us harm knew, okay, a plane has arrived, it's heading out of country. So if these guys are going to make a run for it, it's probably going to be between now and when that plane takes off. And there's one road, and they're, kind of Black Hawk Down style, really narrow, really bad scenes from a security perspective. And, but we, my main guy, a guy named Tige, who was incredible, and the one local authority who was providing us protection, he brought in some favors and got us in the truck. But halfway there, we got pulled out of the truck, and there's this, I thought that, okay, this is game over. And actually Peter and Fabio and I had these devices that have an SOS button, which I still to this day don't know, whether that would have, there's supposed to be, if you're hiking in the mountains or an avalanche, you hit that. But in Puntland, there's no one there, so I'm not really sure what that would have done other than panic my wife and, but nonetheless, we had discussed I talked to Peter and Fabio and said, if we get pulled from here, we don't get separated, if at all possible. And I want you guys to have your hands. I said, Fabio, stop shooting. We're not shooting the stage. And I want you guys to have your hand on SOS. And if I do something in particular, then we all hit it, but do not hit it before then. And we got stopped very abruptly in a way that really, truck came in front of us from a blind corner, and guys with guns got out, opened up the door really aggressively and told us to get out. And I thought, okay, this is going down. So I got out and told them to stay in, and I didn't hit the button because it soon thereafter became apparent. Tige basically talked to the guys. They got back in their truck, pulled their convoy around, and started driving off. And we started following and thought, okay, so they're taking us somewhere. So this is how it's going to happen. But I still hadn't hit it. And I finally asked Tige, what's going on? And he said, those are my guys. And I was like, Tige, maybe you could tell me these things, I almost called in the cavalry if there was. So, but we made it to the airport and out we went. And yeah.
I have so many questions, but I'll limit it to what I know best. So you threw out a big number on dumping of oil. So my question is, who's dumping? So it's 3 parts, I think. What are they dumping? 4 parts. How do you know? And where did you get that number?
Sure. So the number is crunched by a professor's name I'm forgetting, but it's in the footnotes of the book, of a University of Delaware professor who works on this sort of stuff. What they're dumping, and we worked for a while sort of trying to figure out how to refer to what it is, and also his explaining to me kind of how he came up with it. I won't do justice to it, but what they are dumping, his methodology, but what they are dumping is oil and sludge, typically, if you combine those 2 things together from the engine room. So after there's some cleaning of the brown water and the black water, and the stuff that is sloughed off is one type of waste. And then there's just oil that comes from leaks all throughout the ship, and that's another kind of waste. Those two things combined are what amount to the statistic that we calculated. I'm happy to sort of give you I've been asked this before and had a ready-made sort of calculation explanation. I couldn't possibly do it up here.
But how do you know this? Because this requires, I mean, if we're talking about ships, this requires a certain kind of fraud. So how do you know they're being fraudulent with it's called an oil record book? I don't want to get too deep into this, but what I don't understand is how you know they're fraudulently doing this, and how many, if this is ships we're talking about, how many of them are dumping more than they say they're running through their equipment that's supposed to clean it.
Right. I don't know the answer for that. What I do know is this professor was largely looking at, trying to figure out what his data was, but these were not Western ships that are doing well, actually that's not true. So the case that we looked at specifically was, and have you read the book or no?
No.
Okay. Was a case involving a Carnival cruise ship, one that was caught using a magic pipe and was systematically dumping, and was caught doing it via a whistleblower. And that case, ended up in a prosecution and a $40 million fine, I think it was. But that, again, is one of the rare cases that's caught. How the professor was, pulling numbers for the cases that are not caught, I don't know, but I'm happy to sort of get you a written explanation.
We can chat later.
Sounds good. Yeah.
I'm with a conservation group of Blue Ocean, co-founder. Very few days I find myself where I have to drop everything and not order online, but rush to the local bookstores, 3 or 4 of them, to get the book. I sat down, read I think a third of it at the first coffee shop I could find. It is dark. It's very accurate. One of the things I read in the book that it just kind of stopped me in my day, but it was the fact that you said you would go on sea vessels and you were, visitors and fish are good for about 3 days. You said 30 days to 45 days, and then you kind of became a liability as a reporter, and you would wait for another sea vessel to come by that would pick you up. I mean, that's exciting, but very dangerous too. What happens if no sea vessel comes and they decide you're too much of a liability after taking all these notes? So how did that work out as well as I thought it might have in the book?
So truth be told, I don't think they viewed me as a huge liability. I think to some degree what you're referencing is the methodology used in the sea slavery reporting to get out far enough and on the right vessels, and that involved sort of hopscotching, where we convinced one captain to take us out the initial 50, and then part of our deal was that he would then convince another captain to take us even further, and sort of did that for several jumps until we got to the target vessel. And the way that we did that was, and sort of in compliance with the rules, were you can not pay for information, but you can pay for transport. So those first vessels were always us paying them to take us out and soaking in the scene, but not photographing or capturing them or anything, because we can't use that in a on the record way. So those guys, I don't think they felt at risk from us. The final jump onto the vessel, say the one profiled in the initial story and in the chapter, where we stayed a while, that obviously is the hardest one, because number one, that captain is bringing you on board and we weren't paying him. And so why would he want us there? And number two, we are going to report on them. In this case, we did that a couple of times, and this is again pretty par for the course for this type of journalism. you have to negotiate certain terms. You can be here, but here are my ground rules. And the ground rules of those vessels of the captain were: you don't photograph me, you don't name me, and you don't name my vessel, but you can chronicle here. And the other begged question in this line that often comes up is, but why would they even agree? Why would that captain even agree to bring you on board? Invariably, I mean, first of all, I would say, and I had a photographer and a fixer, that's why or a translator, would simply say, we are there to chronicle the life and work out here. Kind of very few people ever hear about or see what goes on these ships, and we just want to sort of render it. I wouldn't use terms like sea slavery, and honestly, I wasn't strictly looking for sea slavery. I did want to sort of that anthropological initial description. I did kind of just want to capture this world. So it didn't feel inaccurate to describe it that way. And I think you'd be surprised, I am, year in, year out, at how open people are if they think that you're going to give them a fair shake. And so it didn't actually take much convincing to get on those vessels.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. And to the guy who was asking about oil, please do get in touch with me because I would like to do a better job answering that question, but best for me not to try to wing it at the mic, but actually show you a written explanation. Then you can challenge the methodology as much as you like, and I'll introduce you to the professor and you guys can go toe to toe, but I'm not going to attempt to channel that information. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi. My question was about the initial pieces that you wrote for the New York Times and how, three questions. Was there a change in law enforcement on the issues that you raised in your initial pieces? What was that reaction? How has it become more stringent in some cases? And how have those responses, what do you think what does that tell you about the future of policing in these lawless places?
And you're interested mostly in the sea slavery as opposed to murder on camera or abuse of stowaways or intentional dumping, or you're
yes.
I'm not being snarky.
What,
which topic most interests you? It has its
the
own
sea
answer.
slavery. Yeah. That was what initially hooked me into the series.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So there are sort of two answers to that depending on the stage of reporting. You asked about the first stage, but there's also an interesting answer that's different in the second stage. In the initial reporting, the sea slavery reporting, a bunch of things occurred from the meta to the infrastructural level. On the meta level, the U.S. State Department got very interested. John Kerry became super fixated on, and he was in office then, on this. And there was a lot of direct engagement, a lot of it off record, about with the Trafficking in Persons Office of the U.S. State Department about how to engage in policy and things like that. And so there was a lot that came from that from the U.S. government side. The EU, which has a yellow carding, red carding, kind of hierarchy, also got very engaged in the reporting and sort of wanted to know both about the specific cases cited and some of the players, but also the policy concerns that connect. So that began a 4-year conversation with key players about everything from, well, I'll go down the litany, but then the second stage, which was, okay, now I'm on book leave, I'm going to go back to Thailand. I'm going to look at many of the things that came in the interim, thanks to the Associated Press, thanks to The Guardian, thanks to the Environmental Justice Foundation, thanks to the U.S. State Department, not just thanks to the New York Times. And I'm going to really look aggressively and fairly, now that the Thai government is very open and saying anything you want, you can get on our vessels, et cetera, et cetera. I was like, okay, I'm going to use this to try to assess what they're doing. So what were they doing? And again, it's better explained in the book because a lot of time is spent trying to talk about how many of these changes they made were really great on paper, but had really fundamental flaws in their application. Case in point. So the Thai government really leaned into doing in port, so port in, port out, PIPO it's called, inspections of vessels so that they could assess not just the illegal fishing issues, but the human trafficking and labor abuse issues when the vessels came back to port. They also did, to some degree, at-sea boardings and inspections of these situations. I wanted to see the at-sea ones because those are the hardest things to do, and in my view, the more likely ones where you'll catch these cases. Once they come in port, they've offloaded guys, they've cleaned up the, So I went to Thailand and said, I want to embed on your at-sea inspections. And they said, great, let's do it. And when I got there, I realized they had no method, no functional method of prioritizing which vessels to board. So they kept asking me in the lead up, which vessels do you want to board? And I kept saying, I want to board the ones that you guys are intending to board. And then I want to ask you, and I gave them lots of lead time. I want to ask you, why'd you choose those vessels? Like, what's your mechanism for categorizing the ones? They didn't really have a mechanism. And so literally 48 hours before we were about to leave port, they kept being like, so where are we going? And I was like, okay, this is really bad. And then I did what they should be doing, which is I talked to the relevant people in ports, a lot of these anti-trafficking folks who actually had intel from interviews with workers about which vessels had the bad stuff going and which companies those were for. And then we look at the vessels that are in the water at the time. Okay, which vessels are owned by those companies? There's our red flag ones. Let's go to that. Point one. Point two, little subtle things like how the inspection process was conducted. So you get on a vessel, you come unannounced. Let's say it's a vessel with 40 Cambodian crew, 5 Thai officers, and 1 bosun, middle guy, who is Cambodian, but he answers to the officers. Okay, so that's the cast of characters. And the bosun is important to know. Is of the ethnicity. Maybe it's Laotian, maybe it's Burmese, whatever, but the bosun's always going to be one of them, speaks their language. But he's also going to be the guy that administers the beatings, does the disappearing. Okay. So we're boarding these vessels, and the Thai government doesn't have translators. So they're doing interviews, worker interviews, in really vulnerable situations, and they use the bosun to translate. So, we witnessed this and realized, okay, so you guys spent 9 months, set up this whole thing. You've got all sorts of interesting policy changes, but you have this going on. You're never going to get. And what that results in is a spreadsheet that's produced by the International Labor Organization, UN agency that does its own inspections. Its stats on these issues, violence and wage theft and et cetera, are one thing, real numbers. The Thai government stats are zeros. Why? Because they're not getting any actual true intel in these interviews. Not to mention, even if they were, they have, at that moment, this was a good year and a half ago, but at that moment had no mechanism or plan for when the guy says, I need to get off here, and he takes that chance, what's the plan for dealing with him? And what we found out as we were embedded with him is there is no plan. They're going to leave him on there and then pick him up when he gets back to port. Mm-hmm. And I was like, this is a big problem for us as reporters, being complicit in something that's life or death dangerous for these very people. So these are the sort of fundamental flaws that even a well-intentioned, well-resourced, motivated government run into. And then the last thing I'll say is these are the subtle ones, like the very inspector, nice guy, sort of well-intent, I think, has a clipboard of things he's checking for when he interviews and when he does his inspection of the gear and the captain and the books and talking with the crew. And he is asking questions in a clipboard exercise sort of way. So this is your actual name, right? Yes. Show me your paperwork. Good, got it. This is what he's doing. If he actually is intending to get to the bottom of things and investigate, he's got to ask things in a very different way and also feel safe in doing so. Like that if he finds something, he's not going to get reprimanded for why'd you embarrass us in front of the New York Times guy? He's got to feel empowered to actually find the things that he's supposed to find. And those guys don't feel that way, nor are they equipped to do it. So these are the sort of things that
I guess as a follow-up question, I meant, if the Thai government or officials are not really pulling their weight, does that suggest, the international community should really be stepping, or how should that work?
Yes, the international community needs to be doing more. I think you look at places like Vietnam or Cambodia and compare them to what Thailand's done, and Thailand's doing a hell of a lot. So I think the book is very hard on Thailand, but it also tries to point out that way worse in surrounding countries that have equally large problems but haven't had the media attention. And yeah, I think international, I think the retailing community, average consumers, large buyers, Walmart, these folks have to play a huge role in cleaning up their supply chain, and EU and large sort of coalitions of governments need to get involved. Yeah,
Thanks.
Sure.
I think it's two questions.
Okay.
Interested in the informal armed security forces you talked about. I'm sure this is in your book, and I think I will get your book. But can you say who generally is hiring them, and if they do operate, I take it, in international waters, assuming they're not going to kill each other because they did something they shouldn't, whose laws are they actually operating under? Are there international laws that they should technically be following, or the laws of the country that most of the crew is from, or the ship that they're operating out of as a security force is licensed to? How does that work?
Okay. So I'll do a fast version of that. The private maritime security guards who are largely making up this force tend to be British, American, South African, some Eastern European, some Indian, some Pakistani, but mostly British, American, South African. Mostly a typical demographic is guys over 50, sometimes a little over 40. They've done a bunch of deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this is the next closest thing in terms of what they're used to doing. And it's, in the best of worlds, decent paying work, but not great. There are a bunch of firms, that oversee these guys and sort of outsource, firms that get contracted. The overarching structure of rules is a bit like the oil book kind of question, a murky realm that would be perilous for me to get into specifically. What I will say is there are, especially in the last 5 years, some rules that have been written by a bunch of players that are meant to apply for all private maritime security, sort of rules of engagement and sort of protocol for a boat's approaching fast. They've got RPGs. It looks really like a real threat. What are the steps you follow? And to before you open fire on the target. And there are a bunch of rules like that. They're great in paper in many ways, an accomplishment. The challenge or the problem I find with all of these things is actual enforcement. And when things go awry, what mechanism there is to, first of all, finding out. So if guys shoot someone and they realize, and maybe that was a legit situation that looked like piracy, and indeed they protected their clients, or maybe it wasn't. But who investigates that, and then who does anything about it, and with what authority? And the answer to that question lies somewhere between the nation. So you're under the authority of the flag the ship flies. So you're part of a flag registry, and if you're flying a Djibouti flag, then those rules apply, or Kitts and Nevis or whatever. But the big problem there is the flag registries themselves are often PO box, kind of companies. Liberia is one of the biggest ones. It's a company out in Virginia, and their main mission is to some degree provide privacy and protection to the people that pay them, namely their clients. And they really don't have any investigation or prosecutorial or oversight capabilities. So it's a bit, in my view, a ruse to think that those entities are the ones that will actually. So when someone doesn't come back, and the spouse of that someone is looking to try to find out what happened to him, they get often in this merry-go-round of, you need to talk with the ship owner, and the ship owner says, talk with the register, and the insurer says, and no one really owns the responsibility of answering those questions. And that's the same sort of situation when things happen to other people at the hands of, and I think that murder case is the chapter that really brings that to light.
Aloha, Ian. My name is Jennifer M. Irwin, and I connected with you a few years back. My question is, what are you able to publicly comment on your experience, your knowledge, to the issue of human trafficking, human smuggling for the purpose of organ smuggling, organ trafficking, things that you saw perhaps on the ship or maritime shipping lanes?
Very little. The only time I overlapped with questions of organ smuggling was a case that was looking at these companies called manning agencies that in many ways play a really important role in finding the workers and sort of handling the logistics of the workers on long-haul fishing vessels. So they recruit the guys and then they fly them to the relevant place and they handle the pay, getting wired to their families when things go well. When they don't go well, which is not infrequently, these companies are essentially sort of incorporated human trafficking entities. And I looked at those worst end of the companies and a case of a guy named Errol Andrade, a Filipino guy who got recruited that way, ended up on a Taiwanese tuna longliner and came back dead. And he was missing some organs when he came back. I chased that possibility that those organs were harvested. I don't think that's what happened there. I think he just had a horrific death and had certain things internally happen to him. And when the first autopsy was done, that stuff was, not to put it too gruesomely, was disposed of. And so when the second autopsy was done by his home country, the Philippines, they noticed he's missing this, and this. And you said he died from a heart attack. That doesn't make much sense. I don't think those were harvested. I think that was just because he probably was either beaten to death or fell off something awful. So
Thank you.
it's a happy note to end on.
I would like to thank Ian Urbina one more time for coming to Town Hall tonight.
Thank you for listening to our Town Hall Seattle Science Series. I'm Jenny Palmer. Our theme music comes from the Seattle-based band Say Hi and Seattle's own Barsook Records. A special thanks to our audio engineer, John Nold. Check out our new season of Town Hall Seattle's original podcast, In the Moment. Each episode, a local Seattle correspondent interviews somebody coming to Town Hall. They get you excited about upcoming events by giving you a behind-the-scenes look into a presenter's content, personality, and interests. If you like our science series, listen to our arts and culture and civics series as well. For more information, to check out our calendar of events, or to support Town Hall, go to our website at townhallseattle.org.